When police arrived at the hospital, they were confused. A 19-year-old girl lay critically ill. Her name was Kerstin. But the real mystery was where she came from. She had no ID, no school records, no trace in any public system. She had simply appeared. Doctors were alarmed. A strange public appeal was made. And then, quietly, cautiously, a woman came forward. A woman who had supposedly vanished 24 years ago. Her name was Elisabeth Fritzl. And what she told the authorities, through trembling lips and decades of fear, would horrify the world. I've been held underground by my father. Beneath a modest yellow house on a quiet Austrian street was something no one could have imagined. A hidden basement, reinforced with steel, no windows, a soundproof dungeon. Behind it, Elisabeth and the 7 children she had been forced to bear. No one heard her screams. No one came to help, because no one knew she was still alive. Her father, Josef Fritzl, had created a prison and played God. What started as a missing persons case became one of the darkest, most twisted crimes in European history. A story of control, captivity, and a stolen life beneath the floorboards of a family home. And here's a haunting question for you. If a woman went missing in your neighborhood for 24 years, do you think anyone would notice? Drop your answer in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. We're building a global community of true crime seekers, and if you haven't already, subscribe, because stories like this are just the beginning. Elisabeth Fritzl was just 18 years old when she vanished. It was August 1984, and she had recently finished a hotel management course. Like many teens her age, she had dreams of independence, of leaving her small-town life behind. But on that morning, her dreams were abruptly cut short. Her mother, Rosemary, came home to find Elisabeth gone, vanished without a trace. There was no forced entry, no struggle, just silence. And then, a letter, written in Elisabeth's handwriting, mailed days later from a far-off city. "Don't search for me. I've joined a religious cult. I need space. Please don't worry." Her mother wept. Her father, Joseph, nodded grimly. "She always talked about leaving," he said. "She's stubborn. Let her go." The police accepted it. The community moved on. The world forgot. But behind Josef Fritzl's workshop, tucked behind a heavy steel door, Elisabeth was not with a cult. She was beneath the house, drugged, chained. And the man who built her prison was the very one the world trusted to search for her. Her own father. And here's something chilling to consider. If someone you loved vanished, would you believe a letter over your instincts? Tell us your honest answer below in the comments. He wasn't just her father. He was her captor. To outsiders, Josef Fritzl seemed ordinary. He was an electrical engineer, now semi-retired, a father of 7, a homeowner in the quiet town of Amstetten, Austria. He loved fixing things, kept to himself and rarely raised his voice. But behind that quiet demeanor was a man obsessed with control. Josef wasn't new to cruelty. In 1967, decades before Elisabeth's disappearance, he had already been convicted of sexually assaulting a woman. He served a short prison sentence, then returned to his family like nothing happened. His record erased, his shame buried. But his urges, they never left. He began isolating Elisabeth from a young age. He punished her harshly, watched her closely, disciplined her for even the smallest signs of independence. And when she turned 11, he began designing a hidden basement beneath their home, brick by brick, steel door after steel door, soundproofed, no windows, no daylight, and no escape. He told neighbors it was for storage, told the city it was a fallout shelter, told his wife nothing at all. It was a dungeon built with precision and purpose. And in 1984, when Elisabeth turned 18, he asked her to help him carry the final door into the basement. It would be the last door she'd walk through, for 24 years. As it shut behind her, he drugged her, stripped her, and chained her to a wall. Then he told her the rules. "You belong to me now." To the world, Josef Fritzl was just a retired old man. But to Elisabeth, he had just become a monster in her own home. In the silence of that underground prison, time stopped, but the pain never did. The cellar was just 600 square feet. No windows, no fresh air, no clock, no calendar, just 4 walls, dim yellow lighting, and Josef Fritzl. At first, he kept Elisabeth chained to a mattress. He fed her once a day, sometimes not at all. She begged, she screamed, she cried, but no one heard her. Not her mother, not her siblings, not a single neighbor, because the walls were thick. And Josef? He made sure every scream was swallowed by concrete. Weeks turned into months. Then the sexual abuse began. He raped her, daily, sometimes in silence, other times while humming to himself. He called her his special girl. He said she was lucky he kept her. And then came the pregnancies. Elisabeth gave birth to 7 children. 7 in captivity. The first child, a girl, died just days after birth. Josef took the tiny body, incinerated it in their furnace, and forced Elisabeth to watch. The next children were born without doctors, no midwives, no medicine, only a pair of scissors and a roll of toilet paper. Josef brought food and diapers when he felt like it, and when the children cried, he beat them, or locked them in another dark room, away from their mother. 3 of the children, Lisa, Monica, and Alexander, were removed from the cellar and raised upstairs with Josef's wife, Rosemary, who believed Elisabeth had run away and was dropping the children off. Josef would forge letters from Elisabeth, saying she couldn't care for her kids, and Rosemary believed every word. The other 3 children, they grew up in the dungeon, never saw sunlight, never walked barefoot on grass, never heard a bird sing. Instead, they learned to walk in darkness, to whisper, to obey Josef, or suffer. Elisabeth tried to teach them as best she could. She made a chalkboard, she sang to them, she even made toys out of scraps. But she knew. She was raising children in a coffin. For years, Fritzl came and went like a god. Above ground, he was the gentle grandfather. Below ground, he was a tyrant, judge, jailer, and rapist. And through it all, Elisabeth never stopped surviving. Every tyrant believes they're untouchable until their own creation begins to betray them. By 2008, Josef Fritzl had lived 2 lives for over 2 decades. Above ground, he was a proud grandfather raising Elisabeth's abandoned children with his unsuspecting wife, Rosemary. Below ground, he was still the jailer of Elisabeth and her 3 underground children. But then came a moment he didn't foresee. Kirsten, the oldest daughter born in the cellar, became critically ill. She was 19 years old, but looked no older than 12. Pale, malnourished, weak. Her organs were failing. Elisabeth begged Josef to take her to a hospital, but the old man hesitated, terrified that doctors might ask questions. After all, Kirsten had never seen the sun, never had vaccines, no birth certificate, no legal existence. But the girl was dying, and Josef, so obsessed with controlling every detail, finally made his move. He dropped Kirsten at the hospital with a handwritten note, supposedly from Elisabeth. The note said Kirsten was her child and she couldn't care for her anymore. But the doctors were immediately suspicious. This girl wasn't just sick, she was completely unfamiliar with the outside world. Her vocabulary was strange. She had trouble walking. Her skin had never been exposed to sunlight. They alerted the police. For the first time in 24 years, authorities began to question the myth Josef had built. And in the cellar below his home, Elisabeth sensed something had changed. Josef began acting nervous. He paced. He watched the news obsessively. Then, he did something unthinkable. He brought Elisabeth and her 2 remaining underground children upstairs. For the first time in decades, she saw daylight. She saw cars, grass, the sky. But most importantly, she saw a chance. Josef told her to stick to the story. Say she'd been missing. Say she left willingly. But when the police came to the hospital to question Elisabeth, She looked them in the eyes and said just 6 words: "I will talk if he's gone." This is where the mask finally shatters. The monster is unmasked, but the world isn't ready for what they're about to hear. Let's pause for a moment. If you were Elisabeth, trapped for 24 years by your own father, what would be the first thing you'd say to the world after gaining freedom? Drop your answer in the comments, and if you're still watching this, you're one of us. So don't forget to subscribe for more stories that reveal the darkest corners of the human soul. Sometimes evil isn't hiding in the shadows, it's sitting right beside you at dinner. When Elisabeth told police she'd speak only if her father was no longer near, they moved quickly. Josef Fritzl was arrested on the spot, but what investigators expected was a case of unlawful confinement. Maybe abuse, maybe neglect. What they uncovered was something far, far darker. Over the next 48 hours, Elisabeth told her story. She spoke through tears, but never broke. She was calm, precise, like someone who had relived the trauma 1,000 times in her head. She told them about the trapdoor hidden behind a shelf in the cellar, the long hallway, the 7 locked doors, the soundproof dungeon that became her home and her hell for 24 years. She described how her father began abusing her before she turned 12, and how in 1984 he tricked her into the basement and never let her out again. She told them about the births, alone. No doctors, no medication, just a mattress and a cold bucket of water. And the rapes. More than 3,000 assaults, she estimated. Detectives were stunned. Some left the room to cry, others just sat in silence, unable to process what they were hearing. Then she told them about the 3 children who grew up entirely underground. Their entire concept of the world came from a single light bulb, and the stories their mother whispered in the dark. Police raided the Fritzl home that night. What they found defied imagination. A maze of steel-reinforced doors, narrow corridors and hidden passages. The air was damp, the ceilings low. There were no windows, no exit unless Fritzl allowed it. The room smelled of rot, decay and despair. There were drawings on the walls, childish scribbles of skies, birds and trees, things the children had never seen. There were notebooks filled with Elisabeth's handwriting where she tried to educate her kids. She taught them to read, to write. She gave them hope, even when there was none. And amid the horror, there were tiny acts of rebellion. A scratched tally of days. An old family photo hidden under a mattress. A small piece of broken mirror, used not for vanity but for memory. That night, Austria learned that one of its quietest homes had been a chamber of nightmares. And the man who built it? Not a stranger, not a drifter, a father, a husband, a neighbour. What is the price of a stolen lifetime? And can a courtroom truly measure that debt? The trial of Josef Fritzl began on March 16, 2009. The world watched, cameras waited, and Austria, shaken and ashamed, held its breath. Fritzl entered the courtroom with a blue folder covering his face. Even now, even after everything he tried to hide. But there was no hiding anymore. He was charged with rape, incest, false imprisonment, slavery, coercion, manslaughter by negligence, for the infant who died in that dungeon. In his first court appearance, he pleaded not guilty to murder and slavery. He tried to argue that he had provided for his family, that he wasn't all bad. But the evidence was unshakable. They showed the layout of the basement, the reinforced concrete, the electronic locking systems, the silent alarm Fritzl had installed to detect any attempt to escape. Then came Elisabeth's video testimony. It was 11 hours long, played to the courtroom behind closed doors to shield her from further trauma. But those who watched it said the room turned ice cold. Even the jury wept. They watched her describe the births, the rapes, the loneliness, the hope that faded over decades. And still, somehow, the love she held for her children. Fritzl broke down halfway through the footage. By the next day, he changed his plea to guilty on all charges. His lawyer claimed Fritzl was not a monster, that he had a troubled childhood, that he built the cellar not out of evil, but confusion. but no one bought it. The prosecution was clear. This wasn't madness. It was methodical cruelty, carried out over decades, covered with lies and protected by silence. On March 19, 2009, Josef Fritzl was sentenced to life imprisonment. He would spend his days in a facility for the criminally insane. He was 73. He'd never walk free again. But here's the haunting truth. For 24 years, the system didn't see. Neighbors heard noises, but dismissed them. Inspectors came, but didn't dig deeper. Family members asked questions, but were told to mind their business. It took a young girl falling unconscious in a hospital for this nightmare to unravel. And still, Elisabeth's real sentence, the one she lived through, was over 2 decades longer than the one her father received. They took her youth, her voice, her world, but they didn't take her will to live. When the steel door finally opened and sunlight touched her skin for the first time in 24 years, Elisabeth Fritzl emerged into a world that had kept turning, without her. She was 42 years old, but inside, she was still every age she had ever been. A teenager locked away, a young mother giving birth in chains, a woman whispering lullabies through concrete walls. For weeks, she and her 6 surviving children were housed in a secure psychiatric facility, guarded by police, therapists, and trauma specialists. They were given new names, new documents, new identities. Not to protect her from the world, but to protect her from the media, the curious, the cruel, the unforgiving public that fed on her pain. She was asked if she would ever speak publicly. She said no, and she meant it. Elisabeth chose silence because for 24 years, her father stole her story. Now she owned it, and she wouldn't let the world reduce her to headlines or horror documentaries. She moved to an undisclosed village in Austria, surrounded by natural beauty, trees, lakes, mountains. Her children? They began therapy, decades of it. Some of them had never seen daylight. Some didn't even know what a car was. One of the girls screamed at the sky, terrified it might fall. They had to learn everything: language, boundaries, trust. Some of the older ones, born in the cellar, struggled with Elisabeth's authority, because in their minds, Fritzl had been their only parent. But slowly, things began to heal. A therapist working with the family described Elisabeth as extraordinarily strong, one of the bravest people I've ever met. She formed a tight bond with her mother, Rosemary Fritzl, despite the decades of estrangement. They rebuilt. Slowly, she built a life where no one would ever control her again. She began painting, gardening, writing. She even learned to drive, and she swore that her children would grow up without fear. Meanwhile, Josef Fritzl withered in prison. In 2022, news broke that his health was failing. He was no longer speaking to anyone. He had changed his name to Josef Meyerhoff, hoping to escape infamy even behind bars. But nothing could undo what he had done. He now spends his days in near-total isolation. Ironically, locked in a room, just like he once did to his own daughter. And Elisabeth. She remains out of public view. She's now in her late 50s, still alive, still healing, but her silence is powerful. It is not weakness. It is ownership. It is the right to say, I owe no one anything, not even my pain. Her story is one of the darkest chapters in modern history, but also one of the most powerful examples of survival. Because in the end, she didn't just survive the cellar. She outlived it. She rose from it. And she built a life from the rubble. Now let me ask you, if you were Elisabeth, would you ever forgive? Could you find peace? Or would you spend the rest of your life haunted by those years? Let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from? What do you take away from this story? And if this deeply emotional journey moved you, subscribe. Because more stories like this are coming. Stories that remind us that even in darkness, the human spirit can endure.